called to order. The General Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 38, entitled, and I quote, "Necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba," end quote, to continue the debate on the item. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Comoros.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, the Union of the Camoros aligns itself with the statement made by the representative of Group 77 and China, of the Non-Aligned Movement, the African Group, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Excellencies, Mr. Minister Bruno Rodriguez Perea, it is our honor to host you here today. On behalf of the Union of the Comoros, I would like to express our unflagging support to the government and the people of Cuba. We commend your resolute determination in the face of the challenges you're facing. Mr. President, my delegation would like to today express its renewed support to the people of Cuba and reiterate our appeal in order to lift the embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. This embargo, which has been enforced for more than 6 decades, continues imposing impossible suffering on the Cuban people. It undermines the people's access to essential goods and impedes their prospects for economic and social development. This situation runs counter to the basic principles of the United Nations Charter. The Charter calls for the respect for the sovereign equality of states and the right to equitable and dignified development. These measures of extraordinary gravity undermine the public services, in particular the National Health Service in Cuba, by limiting access to medical procedures and essential medical equipment. We remain cautious given the designation of Cuba as a sponsor of terrorism and call for the lifting of this categorization. We think this is unjustified and it resulted in immense consequences and nefarious consequences for the Cuban people, for their economy, and at the same time it compounded humanitarian difficulties. This designation further isolates Cuba. It makes access to international financing more difficult, and this directly affects the living conditions of the people. My country fully supports the appeals launched by the international community to lift the embargo. Under this regard, we would like to underscore that the sovereign equality of states and the principle of non-interference in their internal affairs are the essential foundations of international law. Also, we would like to recall that the discriminatory trade practices and the extraterritorial application of national laws runs counter to basic principles. We reiterate, therefore, our firm opposition to the use of unilateral economic measures as a way of exerting political and economic pressure. Such practices undermine global solidarity, they impede multilateralism, and they put the brakes on the road towards progress in sustainable development. Given this, Mr. President, we underscore the importance of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, which is our collective engagement towards a more inclusive and equitable future. The implementation of these objectives, the attainment of these goals, means that we are leaving no one behind, that we are building a world where each nation and each people can aspire to dignity, prosperity, and peace. Together, we can build such a future of shared prosperity. And whilst we're waiting for the day, the Comoros would like to reaffirm our full support to the resolution aiming to put an end to the embargo. We hope for a near future where the Cuban people will have full access to global resources and will live in peace, dignity, and prosperity. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant.
I thank the representative of the Camoros. I now give the floor to the plurinational state of Bolivia. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Allow me to thank the presidency for convening this crucially important meeting. It's important for the United Nations and all member states. I wish to convey to you the brotherly greetings of the Bolivarian people from the people of Cuba. We are in the presence of Cuba's Foreign Affairs Minister, His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez. We align ourselves with the statements made by the delegations of Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, by Iraq on behalf of the G77 and China, by Honduras on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, and by Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, 1 more year has elapsed of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States against the sisterly Republic of Cuba. We've had 1 more year of many breaches of the overwhelming decisions made by this General Assembly. In accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law, this Assembly has roundly rejected the blockade and has called tirelessly for its lifting. This blockade is a protracted and inhumane attack designed not only to suffocate the economy of a country, but also to see its people yield and fall on their knees. However, despite the cruel nature of this collective punishment and the grave consequences it's had for the people's development, the Cuban people keep resisting. They face deprivation that no nation deserves to withstand, and this in the midst of the 21st century. Consequently, Bolivia condemns in the very strongest terms this unjustifiable policy, a policy which is a mass, flagrant, and systematic violation of human rights, the most basic human rights that should be enjoyed by a people. Myriad bodies and experts view this embargo as an act of economic war aimed towards a genocide because it affects all productive sectors of the country's economy, such as construction, tourism, transport, civil air engineering, the industry, etc. The extrajudicial application of laws under the Helms-Burton Act means that businesses, vessels, and ships are persecuted. That is, vessels sending fuel and other essential inputs to the country. Not only does this violate Cuba's sovereignty, but also undermines the Cuban people's right to self-determination, and it hampers efforts made by its government to fight against poverty and inequality. In practical terms, what we're seeing is a threat to multilateralism and a transgression of international trade law and international laws regarding the freedom of navigation. Bolivia is committed to the principles of the UN Charter and of international law and convinced of their importance. Once again, we join the international community to condemn and repudiate in the very strongest possible terms the unilateral, immoral, and criminal economic, commercial, and financial embargo that has now been in place for more than half a century. It's been imposed by the United States against our sisterly Cuba. President, Excellencies, moreover, my country condemns the systematic interventionist initiatives seen by the hegemonic power. They claim the authority to draw up unilateral lists of sovereign countries. We demand that the State Department of the U.S. withdraw the Republic of Cuba from their list of state sponsors of terrorism without delay, because them being on that list has ratcheted up the blue blockade and stopped Cuba from integrating into international trade and stopped them from conducting financial operations. Mr. President, the adoption and implementation of unilateral coercive measures as a geopolitical weapon and instrument of economic coercion hampers the full enjoyment of all human rights. It works against independence, sovereignty, and the right of self-determination of the peoples. For 30 years, this General Assembly has been adopting resolution after resolution, demanding that the governments of the United States end unconditionally their policy of an embargo against Cuba. The disregard for this resolution demonstrates that there are countries that have gained through this decision. They don't respect the decisions that don't suit them, but they otherwise comply with resolutions of the General Assembly. In light of the above, Mr. President, Bolivia will support and vote in favour of the draft resolution that today is put before this Assembly because we reject this immoral economic, commercial and financial embargo, but we also call for and demand that the inhumane unilateral embargo imposed by the United States be lifted immediately. The struggle of the Cuban people is also one of Latin America and the Caribbean, and it is a struggle of all the peoples of the world. Thank you. I thank the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia. I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Mr. President, we gathered today to demonstrate our determination in confronting one of the most persistent and pressing challenges to international peace and security. The expansionist policies and unilateral coercive measures imposed by certain governments, the rising reliance on unilateral coercive measures coupled with an interventionist, flawed and short-sighted foreign policy is a clear indication of unrestrained unilateralism. Unilateral sanctions are a method used to achieve narrow-minded national objectives, but they have a serious adverse impact on the promotion of peace both regionally and internationally. They are fundamental impediment to establishment not only a peaceful and prosperous world, but also a just and equitable international order, which is a vital prerequisite for sustainable development. Tragically, at this critical moment in history, the world faces complex challenges that demand unity and multilateralism more than ever, especially in the amidst of the genocide and the brutal and increasing crimes of the Israeli apartheid regime against the people of Gaza and Lebanon. The United States and certain European countries persist in pursuing unilateral coercive measures that threaten international peace and security. These unlawful measures rooted in arrogance and unilateralism endanger multilateralism, destabilize the global order, and undermine the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations. The inhuman sanction and blockade imposed in Cuba by the United States for more than 6 decades under pretext such as promoting democracy represent the most unjust and prolonged system of unilateral measures ever applied against any country. Cuba's sanctions are in no way short of a military blockade which is prohibited under modern international law. Mr. President, we are here today to stand in solidarity with Cuba as we have done for the past 33 years. Each year, this Assembly, the most inclusive and representative body of the United Nations, has overwhelmingly called for the immediate and unconditional lifting of the embargo. The international community recognized that such unilateral measures deprive the Cuban people of their basic rights, including access to health care, education, and a dignified standard of living. This debate, however, goes beyond Cuba alone. The imposition of unilateral sanctions is a broader symptom of a policy framework that punishes independent nations that refuse to conform to the hegemonic agenda of the particular states. It is actually a method of warfare disguised as a peaceful targeting people from other independent countries. Regrettably, the United States has been addicted to imposing such methods of warfare against a state that don't submit to or follow their contradictory and expansionist policies. Mr. President, the international community must reaffirm its commitment to multilateralism and the principles of the sovereign equality and non-interference. We call on all member states to reject unilateralism by their action, not just word, and oppose any measures that undermine peace, stability, and development. The embargo against Cuba must end immediately and unconditionally. This will not only bring relief to the Cuban people, but also send a powerful message that the era of the coercion, domination, and economic terrorism must come to an end. The Islamic Republic of Iran stands in unwavering solidarity with the people and government of Cuba in their struggle against unjust measures. Together with all nations committed to justice, we will continue to advocate for the elimination of all forms of unilateral coercive measures as they threaten not just individual nations, but the entire framework of international cooperation and peaceful coexistence. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Excellencies, Your Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Friendly State of Cuba, I thank the Secretary General for his report on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. And in this regard, I wish to align myself with the statements made under this agenda item by Iraq on behalf of the G77 plus China, the Chad on behalf of the Arab group, Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, and Cameroon on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Mr. President, Egypt reiterates its unequivocal and steadfast support to the government and people of Cuba. Unilateral coercive measures, especially the embargo imposed upon Cuba, adversely affects vital sectors in the Cuban economy. These measures have led to concrete negative repercussions on the economic and social life of the friendly Cuban people. The Cuban people has suffered impediments to the right to food, medicine, education, advanced technology, as well as development in general. And in this regard, Egypt underlines the need to respect the principles of multilateralism, the United Nations Charter, and international law. And we stress the need to respect the GA resolutions established and adopted in this regard. These have been adopted session after session by the international community. Egypt once again underlines that the ongoing embargo imposed upon Cuba will not, in fact, curtail our efforts as the international community to continue to call on the lifting of these measures that contradict international law. We call for the full and immediate lifting of the embargo imposed by the United States on Cuba to allow the Cuban people to achieve sustainable development. And in conclusion, Mr. President, there is a dire need to ensure constructive cooperation, which has paved the way to the adoption of the Pact of the Future. And during the Summit of the Future, we called for renewed trust in our international order, renewed solidarity and international cooperation amongst all governments and states. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Señor Presidente, quisiera
Mr. President, I wish to begin by greeting the distinguished delegation of Cuba, chaired by the Minister for Foreign Affairs of that friendly country. My delegation aligns itself with the statements made on behalf of CELAC, on behalf of the non-aligned movement, and on behalf of G77 and China. Allow me now to add a number of brief comments in my national capacity. My statement today will be very brief, Mr. President, because the message that I wish to convey is clear, unequivocal, and makes no bones about its content. As we've said in many international fora over the decades, I now wish to again reject the fact that Colombia firmly rejects the economic, financial, and commercial embargo imposed unjustly upon Cuba by the United States of America. For the vast majority of the member states of this General Assembly, it's clear that unilateral coercive measures run counter to international law and directly undermine the rights of the Cuban people, imperiling their well-being, affecting all of the economic sectors of the country, and stopping the economy and the people from interacting directly with the international community. We adopted the Pact for the Future only a few weeks ago. All members of the United Nations in that pact reiterated our commitment at the highest level to lend decisive momentum to the implementation of Agenda 2030 and its Sustainable Development Goals. However, there is a contradiction here. The blockade against Cuba directly interferes with that process insofar as the consequences that it has will not allow the Cuban people to achieve these goals, nor make progress with the implementation of the Pact for the Future. Mr. President, the unilateral inclusion of Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism is also unjust and unacceptable. Colombia knows firsthand that far from supporting terrorism, Cuba has worked tirelessly supporting the search for peace and the resolution of armed conflict in my country. Everyone is well aware that Cuba was key in achieving the peace agreement of 2016 reached between the government of Colombia and the FARC-EP guerrilla, and everyone knows that after the Havana agreements were signed, Cuba was the guarantor country. Cuba played a key role in implementing the first phase of those peace agreements, particularly when it came to disarmament, demobilization, and the reintegration of former combatants. Yet still today, Cuba continues to be key in implementing a total peace in Colombia and is working actively to steer additional negotiations with other armed groups in Colombia. For this reason, once again, we speak out loud and clear to call for Cuba's withdrawal from that ignominious list. We support the Cuban people in their appeal for these measures to end. They run counter to the core principles of international law as well as to the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. The government of change of President Gustavo Petro hopes that the day is near where the vast majority of the member states of this organization will finally have their wish granted. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the representative of the Congo.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I would like to thank you for the leadership you have shown in steering our work and assure you that you have the full support of the delegation of the Republic of the Congo. We align ourselves with a statement made by Iraq on behalf of Group 77 in China, a statement made by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, and by Chad on behalf of the African States Group. And we would like to also make some additional comments in our national capacity. Mr. President, It's for the 32nd consecutive time that we are here in this historic hall to discuss a situation which continues calling upon our conscience. It's a situation seeing which we morally cannot just do nothing. This is what is in question is the long-standing economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States, an embargo which leads to untold suffering on the part of the innocent citizens of the country. The report A7980 by the Secretary General on Agenda Item 38 to the 79th General Assembly of the United Nations shows very clearly that the international community, yet once again, is firmly in support of putting an end to the embargo, which has lasted for several decades and which is a policy of unjust and unjustifiable sanctions. Mr. President, it is high time that this embargo, which runs counter to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, it's high time for it to be just simply abolished. Its continued existence is a major development to the socioeconomic development of Cuba and a serious challenge when it comes to Cuba's implementing Agenda 2030. The Republic of the Congo would like to appeal to the wisdom of the American people and the sagacity of its leaders and urge the government of the United States to turn over this page forever, this painful page in the history of the relationships between the two people. To conclude, I would like to say that the Republic of the Congo invites all of the member states of the United Nations and observer states to support overwhelmingly the resolution of the General Assembly entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. I thank you. I thank the representative of the Congo. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Non-Aligned Movement, and the Group of 77 and China. Pakistan has an unwavering commitment to multilateralism. We believe in the fundamental principles of sovereign equality, non-interference, and non-intervention, as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Pakistan maintains that the imposition of unilateral economic measures is counterproductive and inconsistent with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the UN and international law. Pakistan recognizes the right of the people of Cuba to their own means of subsistence, especially food and medicine. Moreover, the extraterritorial application of domestic law, including unilateral coercive measures that affect international humanitarian law and international human rights law, is inadmissible. The impact that the economic, financial, and commercial embargo has had on Cuba and its people is deeply concerning. In this regard, we also take note of the report of the Secretary General, which raises similar concerns. Such measures are counterproductive to achieving our collective goals enshrined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Pakistan reiterates its support for the draft resolution A/79/L6. We believe that ending the embargo would be a significant step towards improving the quality of life for the Cuban people and will help Cuba to achieve and advance on the path towards sustainable development. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan. And I now give the floor to the representative of Belize.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Belize aligns itself with the statement delivered by Iraq on behalf of the Group of 77 and China, Grenada on behalf of the Caribbean community, as well as Honduras on behalf of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, and Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. I wish to acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, His Excellency Bruno Eduardo Rodriguez Parilla, and welcome him and his delegation to this important session of the General Assembly. Mr. President, Belize unequivocally condemns the illegal and unjust unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States of America and calls for its immediate and unconditional end. The long-standing blockade is in blatant violation of international law and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, infringing on Cuban sovereignty and its inherent right to determine its own political and economic path, free from external interference and coercion. For more than 6 decades, this embargo has inflicted severe economic hardship on the Cuban people, cutting off access to essential goods, services, and resources needed for their development. Its impact has stifled growth across all sectors of society, from healthcare, education, infrastructure, and energy. The 2020 global health crisis further exposed the inhumanity of such policies, as Cuba struggled to procure medical supplies and critical resources, despite its commendable efforts to provide medical assistance and vaccines to other nations in need during the pandemic. Mr. President, the embargo is not only a barrier to Cuba's economic development, but fundamentally restricts its capacity to protect its people against crises, such as the escalating impacts of climate change and natural disasters, which have become more frequent and severe. The recent devastation and loss of life from Hurricane Oscar, compounded by Cuba's ongoing energy challenges, highlight the embargo's crippling effect on the country's capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies. This is the stark reality of the embargo, a policy that only serves to inflict immense suffering, denying the Cuban people their most fundamental human rights. It is a policy that stands in direct opposition to the international community's clear and united call, repeated year after year in this very assembly, for its termination. Belize further condemns the arbitrary and baseless designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism by the United States, which only serves to perpetuate a narrative that is not reflective of the principles or actions of the Cuban government and people. This designation only exacerbates the challenges the Cuban people continue to endure under the blockade. Belize calls for the immediate removal of Cuba from this list and encourages the United States to resume the path of dialogue and diplomacy that respects Cuba's sovereignty and the rights of its people. Mr. President, despite these unjust obstacles, Cuba has continued to exemplify resilience, solidarity, and generosity, providing invaluable support to our region. Their commitment to mutual aid and cooperation has been transformative for Belize, significantly enhancing our national capacity in key areas such as healthcare, education, sports, and cultural development. Cuban doctors and medical professionals frequently deployed to Belize have provided vital health services for our people, helping to address medical needs in underserved communities and enhancing our healthcare infrastructure overall. In education, Cuba's scholarship programs have allowed over 200 Belizean students to pursue advanced studies in fields important to our national development, such as medicine. Additionally, Cuban technical experts have worked alongside our own, contributing valuable expertise and resources in areas such as agriculture, tourism, and climate change. These collaborations have built lasting capacities that will serve our country well into the future. The government of Belize reaffirms its unwavering commitment to standing in solidarity with the Cuban people. We will continue to call for the lifting of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo so that Cuba may rebuild its economy freely, fulfill its development potential, and provide a prosperous future for its people. Belize therefore fully supports Resolution A/79/L6 and will vote in favor of it. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Belize. I now give the floor to the representative of Angola.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The Republic of Angola welcomes His Excellency Bruno Rodrigues Parrilla, Minister of External Relations of the Republic of Cuba, and this delegation to this session. We thank the Secretary General for his report entitled "The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba." Angola associates itself with the statement delivered yesterday by Uganda, Iraq, and Chad, respectively, on behalf of NAM, G77 China, and the African Group. The consideration of these agenda items takes place at a very critical time for the Republic of Cuba, which is currently facing challenges with its national electrical grid that have severely impacted the lives of Cuban citizens and its economy. Mr. President, the embargo and the unilateral coercive measures imposed on the people of Cuba are one of the most burning diplomatic issues in the multilateral arena today. For years, most of the UN member states have been defending the immediate and unconditional end of the embargo. We express concern with the fact that despite several resolutions being adopted by this General Assembly, in that sense, the situation remains unchanged. Cuba continues to experience major economic and social difficulties with the restriction on imports and exports, including food and drugs. The restrictive and discriminatory measures and unfair barriers prevent the implementation of macroeconomic programs and the country's full integration into the international trading system. Therefore, this embargo has severe implications on Cuba's ability to achieve sustainable development goals by 2030, risking the country to be left behind. Moreover, the financial blockades has extraterritorial implications on third markets. Mr. President, the Secretary General reports A79/80 clearly indicates that the continuation of this financial and commercial blockade against Cuba and its inclusion on the list of state sponsors of terrorism are incompatible with an international system grounded in the rule of law and are a blatant violation of human rights, including the right to development. The recently held Summit of the Future made a strong call to enhance cooperation on critical challenges and address gaps in global governance. In this regard, it is fundamental that we respect, preserve, promote the principle of the UN Charter and the provision of international law as they constitute the essence of multilateralism and a collective effort to maintain international peace and security, economic growth, and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Mr. President, the Republic of Angola has consistently supported all initiatives and relevant United Nations resolutions calling for the immediate end of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba, since it does not conform to the purposes and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter and the obligation of state under international law. Equally, we call on the immediate removal of Cuba from the list of states that sponsor terrorism. This blocks the country from performing financial transactions to acquire the necessary goods and services to respond to its population's basic social and economic needs, including renewing its power grid system over the last few years. To conclude, Mr. President, Angola believes in the strategic importance of dialogue and unequivocal respect for international law to achieve peaceful and sustainable resolution of conflicts and disputes. In this regard, we encourage a constructive dialogue between the United States of America and the Republic of Cuba to initiate, build, and consolidate a new era of cooperation based on mutual respect, sovereign equality, for the benefit of both countries and people. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Angola. I now give the floor to the representative of Jamaica.
Mr. President, at the very outset, let me extend my warmest welcome and best wishes to His Excellency, Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. Jamaica aligns itself with the statements delivered by Grenada on behalf of the Caribbean community, by Uganda on behalf of the G77 and China, by Iraq on behalf of the G77 and China, by Uganda on behalf of NAM, and by Honduras on behalf of CELAC. We also want to thank the Secretary General for his regular reports on this issue, and we consider that this forum is critical for UN member states to articulate their perspectives on this unilateral policy. Jamaica continues to believe that this embargo is a flagrant violation of international law and contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We therefore join the international community in expressing our unwavering solidarity with the government and people of the Republic of Cuba in the call for the removal of this decades-old blockade on Cuba. This embargo continues to inflict unnecessary wounds to the Cuban economy and stifle the development aspirations and growth potential of the Cuban people. Mr. President, Jamaica continues this prolonged blockade against Cuba to be contrary to the norms and ethos governing friendly relations between states, international trade, and navigation. This blockade is hindering progress on Cuba's national plan for economic and social development, the implementation of Agenda 2030, and attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, which was consensually agreed by heads of state in this very hall in 2015. The embargo has frustrated efforts by the government of Cuba to contribute to the global fight against climate change, transnational crime, and poverty. It has hampered initiatives aimed at women's empowerment, social protection for the most vulnerable, and transformation of the economy and society in a challenging and constantly changing global environment. The embargo against Cuba has stymied economic, commercial, and financial activities, thereby hindering regular access to bilateral trade, importation of goods, and access to financial mechanisms through formal and institutional channels. Mr. President, it is abundantly clear that the embargo has substantially undermined Cuba's ability to respond to exogenous shocks, including the impact of natural disasters, such as Hurricane Oscar, that claimed 6 lives only last week, as well as global food, energy, and health crises. Such crises have had significant negative and lasting effects on women, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, and vulnerable groups in Cuba. The embargo has significantly exacerbated Cuba's challenges in its efforts to maintain its electric power grid, an essential tool for economic activity and the provision of the most basic essentials of life for the Cuban people. Fuel and spare part shortages resulting from the embargo have stymied the government's best attempts to stabilize the power supply, with the attendant deleterious consequences for the economy and for the entire population of Cuba, especially the most vulnerable, including children, the sick, and the elderly. This is unconscionable. As a result of the embargo, access to technologies is limited, since the prohibition prevents Cuba from acquiring American products or technology manufactured by American subsidiaries. The embargo makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the government to access credit on the international capital market or financing from the IFIs. The unmerited inclusion of Cuba on the US's list of state sponsors of terrorism further restricts entities from conducting legitimate business with Cuba and deepens the challenges for third states' engagement with Cuba on trade, investment, developmental aid, international cooperation on transnational organized crime, and provision of technical assistance. Cuba's inclusion on such a list restricts its ability to procure oil supplies, since oil cargo companies, insurance companies, and other parts of the supply chain require additional charges from Cuba to hedge their risks. These are but a few of the real-life consequences of the embargo for the ordinary people of Cuba. This cannot continue indefinitely. The international community has been seized of this matter since the first tabling of this resolution at the 46th session of the UN General Assembly in 1991. Every year since 1992, the international community has consistently and resoundingly expressed support, as evidenced in the favorable voting outcomes, for the need to end this blockade against Cuba. Mr. President, Jamaica welcomed the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the U.S. in 2015, which then served to ease restrictions in a number of areas. But notwithstanding this positive step in the right direction, we've seen reversals in the more recent past. But in any event, even those measures were not far-reaching enough and cannot be a substitute for the lifting of the embargo to allow the Cuban people's access to critical financial resources, health products and services, inputs for industrial activities, and importantly, their right to development. We also note that the US's decision in May this year to remove Cuba from its list of countries not cooperating fully in its fight against terrorism, while simultaneously maintaining its designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. This is incongruous with the principles of international law, sovereign equality of states, non-interference in the internal affairs of states, and the right to self-determination and peaceful coexistence. In this regard, Jamaica supports the renewed call for Cuba's removal from the U.S. list of countries considered state sponsors of terrorism. We firmly believe that unjustifiably maintaining Cuba on this list limits opportunities for collaboration and cooperation within the region to address the pressing and intersecting challenges of our time. Mr. President, I wanted to take this opportunity to applaud Cuba's remarkable advancements in healthcare and medical research, despite these many challenges, as well as its unwavering commitment to deepen South-South cooperation amongst developing countries. We commend the commitment, the tenacity, resilience, and innovation of the Cuban people, who stand as an inspiring example of strength and determination in difficult circumstances. Jamaica reiterates its call for advancing dialogue and diplomacy between Cuba and the United States. Jamaica reaffirms its commitment to stand in solidarity with the government and people of Cuba, in concert with the majority of the members of the United Nations, and call for the removal of the embargo and for the full inclusion of the Republic of Cuba in the international community. The people of Cuba must be enabled to access the benefits of international development cooperation, which remain unreachable as long as Cuba is unreasonably deprived of opportunities to participate in and contribute to our collective vision of a safe, just, sustainable, prosperous, and progressive world, leaving no one behind. Before I close, Mr. President, I just wanted to say, at a time when multilateralism is under severe stress and faith in the principles of the UN Charter is being undermined with conflict across the globe, we have a unique opportunity in this moment to restore faith, trust, and confidence in multilateralism by making right this historical wrong and by giving the Cuban people the opportunities they richly deserve. Jamaica will therefore vote in favor of Resolution A/79/L6. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Jamaica. I now give the floor to the representative of Barbados.
Mr. President, Barbados aligns itself with the statements delivered by the Group of 77 and China, the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, the Community of Caribbean and Latin American States, CELAC, and the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM. Mr. President, the principles upon which the United Nations was founded, respect for the sovereign equality of states, the right to self-determination, non-interference in domestic affairs, and peaceful resolution of disputes remain essential to maintaining peace and security in our world today. These principles, enshrined in the UN Charter, demand that all member states uphold the rule of law and foster constructive, peaceful relations. It is in this spirit that Barbados reaffirms its strong opposition to the use of unilateral coercive measures, especially those with extraterritorial reach that violate international norms. Such actions not only hinder legitimate trade and economic activity, but also infringe upon the sovereignty of states. The continued economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba is inconsistent with these principles, and it undermines the very charter this Assembly upholds. Mr. President, last month, during the general debate of the high-level week of the 79th session of the UN General Assembly, my Prime Minister observed that Cuba continues to face the most dire of circumstances due to its exclusion from the global economic system and its erroneous designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. Barbados, as part of its submission to the Secretary General's report, expressed deep gratitude for Cuba's ongoing contributions to our National Health Service, particularly through the deployment of medical personnel to assist us during the COVID-19 pandemic. Cuba's unwavering commitment to solidarity and self-cooperation remains a beacon of hope. The Secretary General's report, A/79/80, presents numerous accounts from member states and UN organizations, all of which highlight widespread opposition to the isolation of Cuba. The embargo stifles economic relations, distorts regional trade, and curtails the ability of neighboring nations to engage in mutually beneficial exchanges. Mr. President, the sentiments we express today are not new. They reflect the deep conviction we have articulated in this Assembly over the years. Indeed, since this resolution was first introduced in the General Assembly at its 46th session in 1991. The government of Barbados once again calls for an immediate end to the embargo and urges the removal of Cuba from the U.S. Department of State's list of alleged state sponsors of terrorism, a designation that only exacerbates the suffering of Cuban people. We believe that dialogue is the path forward. Barbados values its strong relations with both the United States and Cuba and calls on the U.S. government to engage in meaningful negotiations with Cuba to normalize relations. This step would not only reduce tensions, but also pave the way for greater peace, cooperation, and development in our region. As a consistent advocate of international law and the principles of the UN Charter, Barbados will continue to support the draft resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, and will vote in favor of its adoption as we have done in previous years. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Barbados. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Republic of Tanzania.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, My delegation aligns itself with the statements delivered by Iraq on behalf of the G77 and China, Uganda on behalf of NAM, and Chad on behalf of African Group, and would like to add the following remarks on international capacity. Mr. President, first of all, I would like to thank the Secretary General for his comprehensive report showing how the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America is affecting the Cuban people towards achieving the desired level of development. Mr. President, the United Republic of Tanzania reaffirms its unequivocal support for ending the embargo imposed against Cuba by the United States. This stands aligned with our commitment to upholding the principles of sovereignty, mutual respect, and non-interference as enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, the embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba represents a continued denial of Cuba's rights to freely engage in economic activities and pursue national development objectives. In today's interconnected world, such measures only have devastating effects on their economies, people, livelihood, and human rights. These measures violate international law, hinder global cooperation, and always exacerbate humanitarian crises. Mr. President, for decades, the United Nations General Assembly has annually voiced its support for lifting these embargoes, with an overwhelming majority of member states voting in favor of these resolutions. Yet, despite the strong and clear message conveyed by the international community, we have not seen meaningful progress on this front. The embargo continues to undermine Cuba's potential to achieve its development goals and restrict its citizens' access to essential necessities. Mr. President, this embargo not only infringes upon Cuban sovereignty, but also contravenes the principle of multilateralism and mutual cooperation. By upholding this embargo, we weaken our commitment to a just and equitable world order, where all nations, irrespective of size or power, can freely determine their path to development. Mr. President, Tanzania stands in solidarity with Cuba, recognizes its long-standing contribution to the Global South, to the principles of solidarity and cooperation. Cuba's efforts in providing medical assistance, healthcare expertise, and education support to countries worldwide, including many across Africa, exemplify its dedication to promoting global well-being despite its own economic challenges. These actions underscore the importance of removing barriers that prevent Cuba from fully contributing to and benefiting from the global economy. Mr. President, in conclusion, the United Republic of Tanzania is urging all countries imposing unilateral coercive measures to reconsider their stances and encouraging to engage in positive, constructive dialogue, so this will promote multilateralism, respect sovereignty, and protect human rights. We as a member states, let us work together to create a more just and equitable world, free from coercive measures that harm innocent civilians, particularly women and children who are deprived of their human rights, social and economic development. I thank you for your attention, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Republic of Tanzania. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Kenya delegation acknowledges the presence of and sends its warm greetings to His Excellency Bruno Parilla, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba. Kenya aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the African Group, the Group of 77 and China, and the non-aligned movement. The embargo on Cuba has been a long-standing contradiction of the foundational principles of the United Nations. Today, as we gather for the 32nd time, we deliberate on an affront to the principles that define statehood according to the UN Charter. The Charter emphasizes the rights of sovereignty and non-interference and enshrines our collective will towards development and prosperity. However, despite these foundational principles, Cuba continues to bear the brunt of the double standards that degrade the trust we so direly need in each other. The embargo is part of an unfortunate broader sanctions phenomenon that punishes civilians in an indiscriminate fashion and increases the fragility of targeted countries to man-made and natural shocks. Member states of the United Nations should be bound by international law and an abiding aspiration to a multilateralism that respects every member state as an equal. It is all that stands between us and the dangerous law of the jungle in which might is right. Generalized sanctions and embargoes are tools from an unfortunate bygone era that generate such ill will and such injury that they end up harming even the objective interests of those who wield them. Kenya firmly stands with Cuba, as we've done in the preceding years and decades. It is why we will always vote in favor of this resolution, while always hoping that each vote is the last one, because the eventual lifting of the embargo is indeed long overdue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kenya. I now give the floor to the representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would also like to join other speakers in welcoming His Excellency the Foreign Minister of Cuba and his delegation. I would like to thank the Secretary General for his comprehensive report regarding the necessity of ending economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba. My delegation also aligns itself with the statement delivered by Uganda, Iraq, and Singapore on behalf of NAM, G77 and China and ASEAN respectively. Mr. President, as we convene once again in this August General Assembly to deliberate on this important and long-pending issue, the overwhelming majority of member states have continued to collectively call for the United States to put an end to its unilateral measures that remain persistent against Cuba and its people. For over 6 decades, we have witnessed that the rigorous application of economic, commercial, and financial blockade has continued to cause negative consequences for Cuba and its people, extending far beyond the realm of the economy. These prolonged measures have detrimentally affected the fundamental rights of the Cuban people, including their rights to development and survival, as well as their access to essential needs such as food, medicines, and other basic means of daily subsistence. This blockade hinders Cuba's efforts to attain the sustainable development goals and achieve the 2030 agenda. In light of these profound hardships endured by the Cuban people, it is imperative that the international community stands in firm solidarity with them. We believe that it's our shared responsibility to ensure that Cuba, a sovereign UN member state, has the equal rights and opportunities like other nations to thrive and determine their own destiny without interference and hindrances. Mr. President, the Laopedia reaffirms its principled position that the use of all unilateral coercive measures, including economic, commercial, and financial embargo, contradicts the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. and establish international norms. Therefore, we take this opportunity to reiterate our unwavering commitment to the principles of respecting the sovereignty of states, refraining from interfering in internal affairs of other countries, and promoting friendly relations among all nations. On this note, the Laopedia joins the call for the international community for lifting the embargo against Cuba and removing it from the list of states that sponsor terrorism, and ending all unilateral coercive measures against any sovereign state. In this regard, my delegation will continue to join the overwhelming majority in supporting and voting in favor of the draft resolution on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by United States of America against Cuba. Mr. President, in conclusion, the Laopedia urges all member states to amplify our collective commitment to promoting and strengthening multilateralism and the full respect of the principles of the UN Charter and international law. These principles aim to foster equitable and sustainable development while safeguarding the legitimate rights of all countries, especially in the midst of this complex and challenging global uncertainty. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, allow me to begin by congratulating the delegation of Cuba, chaired by Cuba's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. I congratulate them on tabling the draft resolution regarding the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Chile aligns itself with the statement made by Iraq on behalf of G77 and China, by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, and by Honduras on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. We wish to add the following remarks in our national capacity. Chile, in line with its commitment to an effective multilateralism, reaffirms its support for the purposes and principles enshrined in the UN Charter and in international law. These include the principles of sovereign equality of states, non-intervention and non-interference in domestic affairs, and international freedom of trade and navigation. We wish to reiterate that the implementation of unilateral coercive measures runs counter to international law. The only legitimate sanctions are those adopted by the Security Council as it seeks to discharge its mandate to maintain international peace and security in accordance with Chapter 7 of the Charter. Mr. President, every year, for more than 3 decades now, with renewed strength that is born of the justice of this noble demand, the General Assembly adopts by overwhelming majority resolutions which urge an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba. This embargo is a chilling hangover from the Cold War and has been in force now for more than 6 decades. It gravely affects the Cuban people. It adversely affects their economic growth and their access to essential financial resources. It affects crucial sectors in terms of achieving the SDGs, particularly in terms of health, food security, energy, tourism, and investment. And this embargo is exacerbated by Cuba's inclusion on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. That is not only mendacious, but it enrages us as an act because it unjustly affects the Cuban people. It is estimated that the accumulated impact of the embargo over more than 6 decades exceeds $164 billion. It stymies the enjoyment of basic rights on behalf of the Cuban people, including food, health, education, and development. The recent Secretary General report on the effects of the embargo on Cuba underscores the fact that the persecution of Cuban financial transactions in third countries continues to have a significant deterrent effect in economic terms. It limits foreign investments and the access to development loans. It is with great sadness that we note that in our Latin America, a policy that is so anachronical and unjust has been in place for more than half a century. We note with sadness that it continues to be unflinchingly imposed with full disregard for the suffering of the Cuban people. We note with concern Cuba's energy situation worsened by the blockade and Hurricane Oscar, and we welcome the recent announcement by Brazil, according to which it will activate assistance measures to provide fuel and food through various channels. We hope these channels will increase in number. Mr. President, Chile is staunchly convinced that it is only through direct dialogue, multilateral mechanisms and international law that we will resolve differences between states. Cuba, over many decades, has demonstrated unwavering commitment to and made valuable contributions to the international community. Cuba's assistance to other countries in their times of need has been an example of solidarity. Today, the embargo stands as a flagrant and systematic violation of the essential basic rights of more than 11 million Cuban people. That is a reality that the international community has denounced time and time again. Once again, the international community calls for an end to that violation. What has clearly emerged after 60 years is that the Cuban people, standing tall as a people of dignity, has taught us that there is no injustice that can put an end to hope. They've showed us that Cuba is not alone. The vast majority of the world's nations support them. Consequently, Chile will vote in favor of the draft resolution presented as an expression of our unwavering commitment to the Cuban people and to an international order which is just, inclusive, and based on the respect of human dignity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Chile. I now give the floor to the representative of Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We align ourselves with the statements made by the representative of Iraq on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Says the speaker, Uganda on behalf of G77 and China, Honduras on behalf of CELAC, and Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. We thank and welcome our brother, Comrade Bruno Rodriguez, and we welcome the delegation with him here today. We are grateful for the important information provided to us by them. It's clear that our beloved sister of Cuba continues to face great suffering. Capricious displays of imperial hegemony undermine multilateralism, as well as the credibility of the United Nations, and that means that there is now an overriding need to abandon unipolar ways of thinking. With the spirit of liberty, we need to speak out with our own voice, with identity, with our dignity, and in defense of our shared values. The international community must move towards and become a part of the new multipolar world which is already in existence. It must stride towards better integration. It must reject and denounce the vestiges of imperialism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. Cooperation based on mutual respect, the United Nations Charter, and non-interference are crucial for the development of all the peoples of the world. Applying or encouraging the use of economic, political, or any other measures is a violation, a flagrant violation indeed, of international law and, I repeat, of the United Nations Charter. It is reprehensible that today there are states who continue to impose the use of illegal unilateral coercive measures which are arbitrary in nature as a biased, selective political instrument to conduct a frontal assault against dignified, independent peoples who reject their interventionist measures and do not yield before the things that they impose or demand. In the face of this systematic interference, our peoples must unite with political will and in solidarity to reject, condemn, and overcome these aggressions. They must exercise their inalienable right to self-determination, defend national sovereignty, independence, and must build their own model of political, economic, social, and cultural development, free of interference, intervention, threats, or foreign aggression. Many decades have elapsed since 1959. Since then, the United States has had in place its illegal, inhumane blockade and consequently has attacked, triggered, and striven to entrench the destruction of the heroic and generous Cuban resolution. This economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed unilaterally by the United States against Cuba has evolved and has been ratcheted up over more than 65 years. It is one more measure among the myriad acts of terrorism conducted against Cuba. Today, the embargo includes a proliferation of economic coercion and aggression measures. There is the very open intention behind these to isolate, suffocate, or immobilize Cuba. The United States shores these up with a intense slander campaign, and this has included the unfair inclusion of Cuba on the infamous state sponsors of terrorism list. Nicaragua demands that Cuba be removed from that list. The negative repercussions of the blockade have increased over the years, and that has stopped Cuba from having vital access to goods to meet their social, economic, environmental, and human development needs. The United States has on a mass scale and flagrantly undermined the crucial human rights of the Cuban people. In addition, they're showing total scorn for that fact. They violate the Cubans' right to life, food, education, and their right to development and self-determination. What we are seeing is quite clearly an international crime against the Cuban people. Mr. President, in Cuba, in line with the spirit of Fidel, the people resist today more than ever before, and they prevail with bravery over the most brutal blockade ever seen. Very few countries in the world would be capable, as Cuba is, of facing up to such a ruthless, uneven, and protracted aggression imposed to destabilize and visit pain and suffering on the daily life of the Cuban people. Year after year, the international community has declared that it is unjustifiable. That is what the United States is doing in an attempt to justify their attempts to subjugate a people that will never surrender. They are a people strong, driven forward by the will of Martí. They are absolutely resolute. They're a people that have defended with dignity their sovereignty, their resolution, and their socialism. They're an example of solidarity and nobility, an example of just how noble our continent is. Once again, we condemn the immoral and unjust embargo imposed against Cuba. Cuba is always acting in solidarity with others. It is internationalist in its outlook and is always ready to help the international community. We demand an immediate end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the government of the United States of America against the sisterly Republic of Cuba. That is a destructive policy which continues to stand as an immoral act against the Cuban people. This practice is illegitimate, illegal, and erodes the progress made in global economic governance and strips that progress of its credibility. the policy of the US government is anachronistic and politically obsolete. It is interventionist and it continues to be imposed in defiance of the universal appeal ringing out from the people of the world. The United States people have also spoken out against the blockade. And the US, in ignoring them, is showing total disregard for the United Nations. 32 GA resolutions have called for an end to this inhumane blockade. The people of the world, including the people of the United States, will always be with Cuba by its side, walking with Cuba. They want this aggressive policy to be lifted. They want peace, respect, non-interference, and the end of the illegal embargo against Cuba. We are fully convinced that international solidarity with Cuba will remain firm. We are convinced that the General Assembly will today adopt this resolution presented by Cuba. In so doing, it will condemn once again this criminal embargo and all of the extraterritorial measures and implications that continue to worsen against the Sister Republic of Cuba. Nicaragua will also always stand united with the indomitable spirit of Martí, Fidel, Raúl Díaz-Canel, and will always defend the sovereignty and self-determination of the great Cuban people. Nicaragua, as it does every year, will vote in favor of draft resolution A/79/L6. We reiterate our support for, thanks to, and solidarity with this generous, beloved people and government of Cuba. We stand with their heroism and their unconditional solidarity. They stand as an example of sharing brotherliness and sharing their knowledge. They stand as an example in terms of their capacities, their skills, and their commitment to the poorest of the earth, with the sick, with the illiterate. And ultimately what we see from Cuba is that they're always ready to put their experience, to make their experience available to anyone that might require it. Today, we hope that this General Assembly will adopt this resolution presented by Cuba, and in so doing it will be defending multilateralism, the United Nations Charter, and it will be seeking proper understanding, good neighbourly relations, and the peaceful coexistence between nations in order to bring about this culture of peace that we all talk about and desire. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Nicaragua. I now give the floor to the representative of Nauru.
Mr. President, I stand before you today representing the people of Nauru to address the critical issue of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba. This matter extends beyond borders. It speaks to our shared humanity and the principle of solidarity among nations. For over 6 decades, this embargo has not only stifled Cuba's economy, but has also inflicted profound suffering on its people. The embargo serves as one of is not as just a political measure. It has significant implications for the protection of basic human rights. For the people of Cuba, it has restricted access to essential goods, limited opportunities for development, and hindered vital services, including health care and education. This is not just an economic issue. It is a humanitarian crisis that demands our urgent attention. Despite these challenges, the Cuban people have shown remarkable ingenuity and strength. They have built a robust healthcare system that offers care to millions, even beyond their shores, even when at the time the embargo has systematically deprived them of the resources needed to sustain and enhance their achievements. Moreover, the international community has consistently voiced its stance on this issue. Year after year, nearly every member of this assembly has called for an end to this embargo. This overwhelming consensus reflects our shared belief in the importance of equality among nations and the right to self-determination. By disregarding these calls, we are not only undermining international law, but also weaken the foundations of our global community. We strongly urge the immediate removal of Cuba from the U.S. Department of State's list of countries allegedly sponsoring terrorism. Nauru reaffirms its dedication to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, particularly those that advocate for sovereign equality and non-interference in the internal affairs of states. The embargo contradicts these principles and in doing so, perpetuates suffering and stagnation. By ending the embargo, we open the door to opportunities for dialogue, mutual respect, and cooperation, ultimately leading to a more stable and prosperous future for all. In conclusion, Nauru stands firmly with the overwhelming majority of nations advocating for the end of this unjust embargo. We call upon the United States to heed the voices of the international community and take steps toward a more humane and equitable policy. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Nauru. I now give the floor to the representative of Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I join colleagues in warmly welcoming the distinguished Honorable Foreign Minister of Cuba and his team. Mr. President, I underline the statement of Antigua and Barbuda with that presented by Iraq on behalf of the Group of 77 and China, on Uganda on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM, Costa Rica on behalf of CELAC, and Grenada on behalf of the Caribbean community. Mr. President, it has been 62 years since the United States, a close friend of Antigua and Barbuda, instituted its blockade and embargo against Cuba. Time and time again, the international community, through the General Assembly and my Caribbean community, in its several institutions, have long called upon the United States of America to lift the trade embargo on Cuba and allow its citizens to benefit from their fair share of globalization and sustainable development. This unjust blockade of more than 6 decades, Mr. President, has caused untold stress to the people of Cuba and brought about much distress to many families and individuals within her shores. Mr. President, Antigua and Barbuda joins the many voices already echoed here in this hall for Cuba to remove from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. We too find this unfair and unjust. Antigua and Barbuda supports the 5 special procedure mandate holders of the United Nations Human Rights Council who expressed that countries designated as a state sponsor of terrorism is neither clear nor transparent. We therefore call on the United States to lift the blockade and remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and to fully comply with all of her international human rights obligations, including extraterritorial obligations, and to take immediate action to end the blockade against Cuba and remove her from the list of the State Department on state sponsor of terrorism. It is time, Mr. President. It is time to turn a new page of peace, cooperation, and understanding. The economic, financial, and commercial siege applied against Cuba is the main obstacle to the sustainable development of Cuba. The continued application of the embargo also threatens Cuba's full implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, as well as the recently adopted Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS, Abbas, and other international negotiated agreements that we have all signed on to. The international community's call for leaving no one behind must be applied to Cuba, and to fulfill this promise we have made to the global community, Antigua and Barbuda once again calls for an end to the embargo. Mr. President, my country looks forward to the day when we can expand trade with Cuba and build upon the generosity that the Cuban government and people exhibits in providing technical assistance across several areas to Antigua and Barbuda and Caribbean countries, areas such as health, culture, environment, energy, and so on. Mr. President, Antigua and Barbuda again expressed, as we have done in numerous United Nations General Assembly statements, that we are yet again calling for both our friends and partners, the United States of America and Cuba, to come together around the table of diplomacy to discuss peacefully and end to the differences and forge a new relationship based on mutual respect and shared responsibilities. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Antigua and Barbuda. And I now give the floor to the representative of St. Kitts and Nevis.
Mr. President, St. Kitts and Nevis aligns itself with the statements that have been delivered by Grenada on behalf of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, by Honduras on behalf of CELAC, by Uganda on behalf of NAM, and by Iraq on behalf of the Group of 77 and China. We welcome the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, and his delegation. Mr. President, we have gathered in these halls of the General Assembly annually for over 3 decades to adopt with overwhelming majority the resolution titled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Because we are all acutely aware that this unilateral embargo contradicts the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and it violates international law. This outdated embargo that continues to be imposed against Cuba by the government of the United States of America for more than 6 decades, regrettably, remains the biggest impediment to Cuba's normal economic growth and development and modernization. It further continues to impair the country's valiant efforts of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, whilst exacerbating the effects of global challenges on the Cuban nation. My delegation therefore thanks the Secretary General for his usual comprehensive reports on this deeply troubling matter, which continues to shed light on the gravity of the impact of this unjust embargo on the lives and livelihoods of the Cuban people. As observed in the report by the Secretary General from March 2022 to February of 2023, Cuba suffered economic damages valued at approximately $5 billion, which represents an impact equivalent of 19.2% of its gross domestic product for the year of 2022, and 55.8% of total exports for the same year. This considerable financial decline is aggravating the already complex economic situation in this Caribbean country. Mr. President, given this context, St. Kitts and Nevis joins the international community in reiterating unreservedly its urgent call for the lifting of this unfair embargo against our fellow Caribbean island nation of Cuba. St. Kitts and Nevis also calls for the removal of Cuba from the State Department's list of sponsors of terrorism. St. Kitts makes these calls, St. Kitts and Nevis makes these calls to enable Cuba to effectively pursue its economic aspirations and to achieve socio-economic prosperity. As posited by our esteemed Prime Minister, who is a Cuban-trained doctor, the Honorable Dr. Terence Drew, in his UN General Assembly address last month, the embargo has isolated Cuba for decades. It's illegal, and it continues to be a stain on our collective consciences. Instead of denigrating this island, we should elevate and learn from its sustainable solutions that have empowered their people and, in turn, the region. Mr. President, despite the many hardships experienced by Cuba as a consequence of the embargo, Cuba has remained a steadfast ally of St. Kitts and Nevis, supporting our human capacity development agenda through the provision of annual university scholarships for our nationals. And I would have noted that the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis is a Cuban-trained medical physician, especially the assistance provided in the areas of medicine. The assistance from Cuba has assisted St. Kitts and Nevis in buttressing the healthcare services of our country through its continued deployment of highly qualified and committed medical brigade specialists. We acknowledge with immense gratitude our enduring bonds of friendship and cooperation with the Cuban nation. In conclusion, Mr. President, St. Kitts and Nevis therefore calls for renewed dialogue between Washington and Havana to chart a new path for improved relations, to promptly bring an end to this embargo, which continues to have widespread repercussions on the economy of Cuba and the lives of millions who call Cuba home. St. Kitts and Nevis reaffirms its unwavering solidarity with Cuba on this matter and strongly condemns the continued imposition of this embargo. St. Kitts and Nevis will vote in favor of this resolution and will continue to do so until the day this embargo is repealed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of St. Kitts and Nevis. I now give the floor to the representative of the Solomon Islands.
Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered by Iraq on behalf of the Group of 77 plus China and would like to contribute to the debate in our national capacity. At the outset, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, this morning, and would like to reiterate our long-standing support for Cuba. We extend our profound appreciation to the government and people of Cuba for training over 100 Solomon Island medical doctors in Cuba who are now serving in hospitals, health centers, and saving lives in our communities. Despite the imposition of unilateral economic sanction, Cuba proved itself an important partner in South-South cooperation, providing critical support in the health and medical sector to Solomon Islands and to many Pacific Island countries. Mr. President, my delegation is concerned that the prolonged unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba over 6 decades denies Cubans the right to trade, access to goods and services, and violates Cuba's inalienable right to development. Nor does it reflect our collective aspirations to achieve the 2030 Agenda, which we collectively pledge not to leave anyone behind. The report of the Secretary General A/79/80 once again highlights that the embargo remains a stumbling block for Cuba to fully implement the 2030 Agenda and its achievement of the SDGs. This embargo is a relic of the past that should now be discarded. Mr. President, Solomon Islands does not support any unilateral action or measures that perpetuate negative impact on the well-being of the people of another state. Such action is not in the spirit of the United Nations and defies the principles of the UN Charter. To that end, we join the international community in calling for the full implementation of this resolution to bring to an end the economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba by the United States of America. Furthermore, we encourage the restoration of friendly relations between the United States and Cuba in the name of peace and within the spirit and purpose of the United Nations Charter. The world will benefit from Cuba and United States of America's improved relations. In closing, Solomon Islands remains resolved in our solidarity with Cuba on this matter by supporting once again this resolution this year. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Solomon Islands. I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Mr. President, India associates itself with the statements made by the Group of 77 and NAM. Acogemos con beneplácito.
We welcome the presence here today of the Distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla,
for his report on this issue. Mr. President, every year, this Assembly has rejected the imposition of laws and regulations with extraterritorial impact and all other forms of coercive economic measures that hurt the progress and prosperity of the people the world over. Last year, 187 member states voted in favor of Resolution 78/7, expressing their strong support to lifting of the embargo. The General Assembly has also called upon all states to refrain from promulgating and applying, and to repeal and invalidate laws and measures that have extraterritorial effects affecting the sovereignty of other states, in conformity with their obligations under the UN Charter and international law. There is no doubt that the continued existence of this embargo, in contravention of the overwhelming opinion as expressed by this Assembly, undermines multilateralism and the credibility of the United Nations itself. Mr. President, as the world's largest democracy with abiding faith in multilateralism, India stands in solidarity with this Assembly in its unambiguous rejection of domestic laws having extraterritorial impact. Such embargoes have the effect of impeding the full achievement of economic and social development by the population of the affected country, in particular, women and children. They also hinder the full enjoyment of human rights, including the right to development, food, medical care, and social services, among other things. India has consistently opposed any unilateral measures by countries that impinge on the sovereignty of another country. As in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the recently adopted Pact for the Future has also strongly urged states to refrain from promulgating and applying unilateral economic measures not in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations that impede the full achievement of economic and social development, particularly in developing countries. Mr. President, successive reports of the Secretary General have established that the embargo, particularly through its extraterritorial effects, has adversely affected the Cuban people and the developmental efforts of the country, with particularly devastating effects owing to shortages of essential commodities. The continued embargo would severely impact Cuba's ability to implement the 2030 Agenda in the 6 years that remain. Mr. President, people-to-people contact holds immense possibilities for fostering better understanding between nations. There is no doubt that the people of Cuba can contribute much to the needs of the global community today. But to enable this, the international community needs to intensify its efforts to promote an environment free from sanctions and embargoes. India hopes that the embargo will be withdrawn at the earliest and supports the draft resolution moved by Cuba. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India. I now give the floor to the representative of Peru.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Peru aligns itself with the statement made by Honduras on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, by Uganda on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement, and by Iraq on behalf of G77 and China. Moreover, we welcome here among us the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla. Every year, this General Assembly reiterates its staunch conviction that it is necessary to put an end to the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed against Cuba. Last year, 187 delegations, which make up almost all the member states of this organization, expressed unequivocal support for the lifting of the embargo. The broad support this resolution receives every year reflects the opinion of almost all of the international community and is a crystal clear signal that the time has come to put an end to such unilateral measures so that Cuba can make progress along its journey to sustainable development. Mr. President, the most recent report of the Secretary General on the issue under discussion today contains its diagnosis, according to which many bodies, organizations, agencies and programs of the UN system, the diagnosis according to which there are damaging effects that the embargo has on their work. For example, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights provides examples that demonstrate the adverse effects of the blockade on the rights of the Cuban people to health, food and education. For its part, the UNDP states that the negative effects of the embargo have increased exponentially and have become more targeted and much graver in nature than in previous years, particularly in terms of commercial and financial activities. UNDP adds that the blockade also affects the opportunities for local and national development and damages the economic situation of the Cuban people. Moreover, the blockade has an impact on the most vulnerable groups of the population and on human development in general. Once again, UNDP, what's more, states that the blockade has had direct effects on all development programs and projects and emergency activities of the UNDP because the blockade increased transactional costs in terms of obtaining inputs for projects and increasing cost and time for the transport of imported goods. The cost of imposing Peru believes that the unilateral act of imposing a blockade is incompatible with international law, the principles of peaceful coexistence, and the UN Charter. Moreover, the blockade runs counter to the norms of international trade and the principles of cooperation between states. The only legitimate sanctions are those adopted by the Security Council within its remit to maintain international peace and security in accordance with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. In light of the above, Peru will, as part of a state's policy that has been in place for more than 30 years, will vote once again in favor of the draft resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Blockade Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. To conclude, Peru reiterates its staunch commitment to the principles of the UN Charter and of international law, in particular its commitment to the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention and non-interference in domestic affairs, in the international freedom of trade and navigation, and the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all. These must be respected and enjoyed by all states without exception. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Peru. I now give the floor to the representative of Guatemala.
Mr. President, Guatemala aligns itself with the statements made by the G77 in China, the non-aligned movement, and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. Since 1997, the Republic of Guatemala has supported resolutions on the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States against the Republic of Cuba. We've done so in accordance with our commitment to the United Nations Charter and to international law. We'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate our appeal for the lifting of this embargo. We appeal for the restoration of a fruitful dialogue between both parties. Countries who support the General Assembly resolution are of the view that development should not be held hostage by ideological concerns or broader political concerns. Mr. President, my country repudiates any unilateral coercive measures which is in breach of the principles of international trade and international law. We urge countries that continue to retain such provisions within their domestic legislation to take the necessary measures to repeal them without delay. Guatemala notes with concern that these unilateral actions remain in force. They have consequences that affect the development and well-being of the Cuban people. Such measures, for example, include Cuba's inclusion on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. With this in mind, Guatemala will continue to echo the international communities to support and champion actions which lead to a timely and lasting solution, with the overarching goal of lifting the economic, commercial and financial embargo in place against the Republic of Cuba. Consequently, we'll vote in favor of the resolution that the Assembly today has before it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Guatemala. We have heard the last speaker in the debate for this item. I now give the floor to His Excellency Bruno Eduardo Rodriguez Parilla, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba, to introduce draft resolution A79L6. Minister, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, distinguished permanent representatives, distinguished delegates. For 5 consecutive days, from Friday, October 18th to Wednesday, October 23rd. Cuban families had no electricity but for a few hours. They were anxious about the possibility that their food would be spoiled. They knew that it would not be possible or it would be very costly to replace that food. Many Cuban families lacked running water. Hospitals worked under emergency conditions, and schools and universities suspended their classes. Businesses interrupted their activity. The largest businesses only maintained those vital activities. The economy stopped during the blackout caused by Hurricane Oscar, and that began on October 20. The Hurricane Oscar had a devastating impact on the province of Holguin. The hardest hit was Guantanamo, where a U.S. naval base is currently hijacking our territory. Despite the unflinching and effective efforts of the internationally recognized civil defense of Cuba, 8 people died during the hurricane, including a 5-year-old girl. 2 people went missing. The municipalities of Imias, San Antonio del Sur, Maicí, and Baracoa suffered grave damage. Satellite photos showed a country with all its lights off and, moreover, a country beset by heavy rainfall and strong winds. It was impressive to note the calm, understanding, confidence, and the conscientious way in which an entire people mobilized. They offered their solidarity to neighbors and vulnerable citizens, and did so together with 52,000 self-sacrificing and heroic electrical workers. They were far from their families and worked tirelessly to pull off a true feat. They did so together with our party, our government, the Revolutionary Armed Forces, the Ministry of the Interior, and Cuba's bodies of people's power. The primary cause of the national power system failure was the lack of fuel. That affected power generation and sowed instability. And that was all connected to the precarious conditions of our power plants. All of the above is a direct consequence of the extreme economic warfare being led through measures applied by the U.S. government since 2019. These measures of economic warfare were designed in particular to prevent the supplies of fuel and spare parts and components required to guarantee the technical maintenance of our power plants and electric grid. They were also designed to hinder investments and our access to financing. We have overcome our most acute power emergency, but for the Cuban people, normality includes long-lasting and frequent blackouts that affect the homes of individuals and fundamental services. Power generation in our country largely depends on imported fuel. However, it is well known that the U.S. government has continued to implement a policy of maximum pressure. It has done so in violation of international law. That maximum pressure policy is aimed at depriving Cuba of fuel supplies from third countries, and it is applied through sanctions visited upon manufacturers and suppliers, as well as forwarders, brokers, and insurers. In only 1 year, the former Republican government imposed sanctions on 53 vessels and 27 companies in relation to shipments heading for Cuba. The damage done to the Cuban economy during 18 years of the blockade amounts to $252 million. That money that our country loses or fails to receive would be sufficient to guarantee the maintenance of our thermoelectric power stations. It would be enough to purchase the spare parts that would make it possible to ensure the smooth functioning of our power plants and to avoid power outages. The cost of the damages caused by 5 months of blockade is equivalent to Cuba's annual fuel imports. These stand at approximately $2 billion. President Joseph Biden's administration tends to claim that its policy is to help and support the Cuban people. That's what he says his policy is doing. Who would believe such an assertion? We deeply appreciate the meaningful expressions of solidarity with Cuba and the offers of cooperation we received recently from many nations and a wide range of stakeholders. Mr. President, the Cuban economy has in recent years experienced unprecedented difficulties. These have had a critical impact on the well-being of our population. Our people are suffering on a daily basis. Our government works tirelessly to find solutions to such adversity and bitter challenges. This is an unavoidable obligation and a very, very difficult one. The root causes of these situations are myriad, as they may be for any other country. The causes of our current situation are both domestic and also the consequence of international developments which exceed our national capacity for action. What makes our situation unique and extraordinary in Cuba is the deliberate determination of the United States to suffocate our national economy and to sabotage and impose insurmountable obstacles in order to prevent our growth and development. No other country in the world, not even those whose economies are far more robust than the Cuban economy, could cope with such a brutal, asymmetric, and protracted aggression without incurring considerable costs in terms of their people's living standards. The United States is looking to threaten Cuba. They're seeking to state that they will impose deprivation. With the economic blockade against Cuba, imperialism is warning the whole world that any nation daring to firmly defend its sovereignty and to build its own future will pay a price for that rebelliousness. No one could doubt the ability that the US has today to deal a devastating blow to the economy of any country. In the case of Cuba, the US has been doing just that for 64 years. The United States knows only too well that it is violating the UN Charter and international law with such a merciless aggression. The United States is aware that it is violating international standards governing trade and navigation. The US applies or threatens to impose coercive measures against the citizens of any nation, their companies and financial institutions if they trade or establish economic relations with Cuba. Whoever reads the infamous Helms-Burton Act of the United States will understand how this legislation forces the president of that country and its institutions to exert pressure on other countries, to interfere with their relations with Cuba, and to expand its extraterritorial coercive measures and to impose them outside of its own borders and on the member states of this organization. The blockade against Cuba is economic, financial, and commercial warfare, and it qualifies as a crime of genocide. It is a mass, flagrant, and systematic violation of our people's human rights. It is the broadest, most comprehensive and longest standing system of unilateral coercive measures ever applied in history against any country wheresoever. What would Cuba be like today had it had the $164 billion of which the embargo has deprived it since it began? Damages incurred amount to $1,499,710,000,000. If we look at how the dollar behaves against the price of gold. Curiously enough, under such extreme conditions, Cuba has built a social program that has earned world renown. That social program has protected the lives of Cubans, and it has not excluded anyone. Mr. President, since 2017, the previous U.S. administration began to impose additional coercive measures against Cuba to ratchet up the economic blockade. The cruelest fact that was in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, these measures were stepped up to an extreme and even more perverse and harmful scale. They even hindered the purchase of medical oxygen and ventilators. It was a political commitment that was announced by the then President of the United States from the moment of election. The policy was designed to undo the progress made in bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States between 2015 and 2016. President Joe Biden, with surprising duplicitousness, has kept intact the coercive regime by his predecessor. He has implemented it fully aware of its devastating impact on Cuban families. Under Joe Biden's presidency, the losses incurred by Cuba as a result of the embargo amount to more than $16 billion. That means that every day that this criminal policy remains in force, our country loses $14 million. These are exorbitant figures for any nation and are even greater for a small island state developing economy without a wealth of natural resources. That is Cuba's position. The comprehensive report presented by the UN Secretary General pursuant to Resolution 78/7 contains the valuable contributions of 183 member states and 35 agencies, funds, and programs of the UN system. That report is faithful and compelling testimony of the terrible consequences of the blockade on the Cuban people and the island's economy, and the report attests to its extraterritorial effect on other countries. We note the impact of the blockade on the worsening of several essential services and the decrease in supplies that services and supplies that Cubans have actually enjoyed for decades as a result of a policy of social justice and equity. These supplies and services include electricity, health, education, food, water, public utilities, public transport, the production of food and medicines. All of these are services that the people require and for which the scant financial resources of our country are not enough. More than 80% of our people have only ever known Cuba under a blockade. All Cuba's young people have been forced to live in a country under embargo. Cuban families suffer the anxiety and the pain of separation artificially imposed by inhumane measures which affect all of us and which take the form, or have the consequence, rather, of high rates of migration. It would be impossible not to acknowledge that the extreme tightening of the blockade is the main reason why a significant number of Cuban young people have decided to opt for either temporary or permanent ways of fulfilling their potential outside the island, and that has a searing impact on their families and their Cuban homeland. Mr. President, the right to food is a human right. The accumulated cost of 4 months of economic blockade is equivalent to $1.6 billion. That amount would be enough to guarantee for an entire year the delivery to all Cuban families of the rationed food basket. That basket for decades has been given to Cuban families, but today it's not enough to meet their needs. But it does meet their most acute needs and is provided at a heavily subsidized price. The blockade's measures ultimately produce sustained agony for the Cuban people in terms of finding the resources that will make it possible to pay for the contents of shipments that come to the country that the people so desperately need. The long-standing blockade has also had a very severe impact on Cuba's food production. This is because it hinders the availability of fuel, seeds, fertilizers, animal feed, pesticides, and other inputs. All of this adds to the difficulties already listed in difficulties affecting maritime transport and the availability of electricity. It is well known because the US states this time and time again, and you'll hear the same thing said soon by the US representative, that pursuant to legal provisions dating back to the year 2000, the government of that country allows, despite the fact it's absolutely forbidden to export things to Cuba, it allows the exceptional exports of food through license. We're talking here about sales that go in one direction. These sales are subject to extraordinary limitations. These limitations include that of finding credits or loans for any such transactions. Licenses for such exports are only granted for sales that are paid in cash and in advance. Commodities can only be shipped on board U.S. vessels, and these vessels must return empty to their ports of origin. There are needs that Cuba has in terms of covering its people's food needs. Cuba has therefore made use of that mealy-mouthed, narrow possibility in spite of these draconian conditions, but these transactions could actually flower and become true dynamic trade. If the blockade did not exist, the volume could also grow. The same government that authorizes those sales deprives Cuba of the financial resources it requires to import such food or inputs for the food industry from any country in the world, not only from the United States. The human right to health should be sacred. Cuba is capable of producing around 60% of its basic either adjusted or essential drugs list. In recent years, it has been impossible for Cuba to guarantee this production due to the extreme ratcheting up of the measures imposed against our government. These measures have taken a toll on people's lives. Infant mortality has increased, and Cuban life expectancy has decreased. Cuba is deprived of some money, a lot of money. Indeed, we would need the money we lose during 25 days of blockade alone to guarantee the manufacturing and availability of antibiotics, painkillers, hypertensive drugs, and many other essential medicines required for our sick people. These include boys, girls, older persons, and pregnant women. With $12 million, Cuba could buy the insulin necessary to treat all of our diabetic patients. The losses incurred by the blockade within a single day exceed that amount. The damages caused by 9 days of blockade are equivalent to the $129 million necessary to import the expendable medical supplies used by our country every year. These supplies include cotton, syringes, catheters, needles, and sutures, among other inputs. And these supplies also include all of the reagents required by the national health system. 15 minutes of blockade, less time than this speech, that is, are equivalent to $144,000 in losses to Cuba. That is money that we require to buy the implants required by our hearing-impaired children and teenagers. It is still impossible to access the medical equipment, therapies, and medicines best suited to our needs from U.S. companies. We have to acquire this equipment at exorbitant prices through brokers, or we have to replace or substitute these supplies with generics that are not as effective, even to treat the newborns and sick children. The U.S. government is perfectly well aware of the direct and indirect impact that its policy has on the Cuban health system. It is only too well aware of the suffering and the anguish it causes, as well as its consequences in terms of incomplete treatments, delayed treatments, postponed surgeries, and scant medical inputs. It cannot conceal the fact that its goal is quite clearly to visit harm upon the Cuban population. It is fully aware of that fact. Mr. President, no government should pursue as a policy a quest to impoverish and deprive other nations, causing shortages. Far less is it appropriate to do so in a small neighbouring country that has not enforced any measure against the country of that government. It is a collective punishment prohibited by international law and international humanitarian law. Among the measures designed to ratchet up the blockade that have been applied in recent years, we'd like to point out, because it is so slanderous and because it causes such huge economic damage directly and indirectly, the measure I'd like to point out is the U.S. decision to include Cuba in a list issued by State Department that arbitrarily designates countries as sponsors of terrorism. In stark contrast, the U.S. government continues to tolerate and show indifference to individuals and groups that organize, finance, and execute from the territory of that country, the United States of America, violent and terrorist acts against Cuba. An example of such acts was the recent release by the U.S. judicial authorities of an individual who, on October 30th, 2020, stood in the middle of the street and opened fire and shot 32 rounds with a machine gun against the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. That list has no legitimacy whatsoever. Neither does it make any contribution whatsoever to international efforts against terrorism. Rather, it undermines those efforts. It is an instrument of political coercion applied through economic measures that are punitive and through threats. The presence of any country on that list automatically activates a series of coercive measures. In Cuba's case, these cause damage equivalent to that of the blockade and add to that blockade. Among them, we can point to the fact that financial institutions that establish links with Cuba are afraid of U.S. reprisals. Since the beginning of President Biden's term, 1,064 foreign banks have reportedly refused to offer their services to Cuban entities out of fear of U.S. fines. Our nationals in several countries have been refused banking services simply for being Cuban citizens. That is deeply discriminatory. Citizens are also deprived of the privilege of the ESTA visa, an ESTA visa that would allow them to enter the U.S. That allows other countries and other people to enter the U.S., but Cubans or people that have traveled to Cuba are deprived of the ESTA, and that is discriminatory. Over the last year, more than 300,000 European citizens who visited Cuba were denied the ESTA visas. It has an intimidating effect, and in order to amplify that, the list of people whose visa applications have been denied are made public. The United States is seeking in every possible way to prevent Cuba's economic recovery. It's doing so by harming tourism. That is a key source of income. The United States seems to feel it has the right to tell people from other nations which countries they are not allowed to visit, because if they do, they will suffer reprisals. As a political weapon, the United States stymies its citizens' freedom of travel, its own citizens, as well as that of other citizens of other nations. The US government is perfectly well aware that Cuba does not sponsor terrorism and that it has no links at all to terrorism. The presence of our country on that list is totally unjustified. However, it is also evidence of the fact that there are no political or ethical arguments which justify the economic war waged against us. The current President of the United States inherited this nefarious decision. It was a decision taken by his predecessor 9 days before he left the White House. However, President Joseph Biden is absolutely able and has every authority to sign at any time a document which would remove Cuba from that spurious list. We should never have been placed on that list. It would be the only morally and legally right thing to do. The international community has, in its vast majority, recognized that Cuba is not a terrorist country. Myriad governments, parties, parliaments, solidarity movements, and civil society organizations, as well as associations of Cubans living abroad, international organizations, statements made by former U.S. presidents, U.S. Congress members, journalists, and intellectuals. Many such groups have called for Cuba's removal from that list. We also recall here the declaration signed by 123 countries. That declaration pursued a similar goal at the Human Rights Council. Mr. President, over the course of this last year, the U.S. government has announced several measures that it presents to the public as supposed mitigating measures, palliatives for the economic blockade. Don't fool yourselves, they are not. The U.S. is obviously pursuing a political goal. and in so doing, it enacted exceptions within the broad range of prohibitions and reprisals. Supposedly, in so doing, the US government intended to offer opportunities to the private sector of the Cuban economy. This is a sterile and deceitful move. None of these measures are actually practically in force, and they happen to be inapplicable. Small individual entrepreneurs in Cuba also suffer the consequences of the blockade, as do the rest of the population. The alleged opportunities spoken of by the US clash with regulations and prohibitions already in place that are designed to paralyze the Cuban economy as a whole. Our government promotes the harmonious development of all forms of management. These include private or state-owned small and medium-sized enterprises. There is only one Cuba, and there is only one Cuban entrepreneurial system. The US has no right whatsoever to interfere in our constitutional order and in our ever-evolving economic model, nor do they have any right to interfere in the internal affairs of our country or in those of any other country. The economic blockade is not only an instrument of aggression of the US against Cuba. It is accompanied and supplemented by a powerful machinery which is toxic in nature and generously financed with federal funds. And it's an instrument of non-conventional warfare. It designs to sow campaigns of systematic misinformation. It fosters confusion. It incites violence, promotes apathy, pessimism, and mistrust. The US has this permanent misinformation campaign in place to discredit us, and as such, the US is attempting to cynically blame the Cuban government for the impact of the US siege against our population. The intent is to bring about a regime change, to impose political domination, to promote an economic collapse and social turbulence and breakdown. And they are following, the US government is following the guidelines of the infamous memorandum drafted by Assistant Secretary General of State Lester Mallory in April 1960. I quote, "The majority of Cubans support Castro. There is no effective political opposition. The only reliable way of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. We must rapidly adopt all possible measures to weaken Cuba's economic life. Such a policy, as skillful and discreet as it might be, would be very key in denying Cuba of supplies. It would reduce monetary and real wages, and it would do so to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government." End quote. How long will we let this go on, ladies and gentlemen? Let Cuba live. Let Cuba live in peace. Mr. President, in a few days, there will be presidential elections in the United States. The winning government will have an opportunity, whoever that may be, to decide whether to continue applying their failed approach and the inhumane siege measures of the last 6 decades. They can choose between that or finally and democratically heeding the will of their own people. And they can decide to heed the appeals of the overwhelming majority of the international community and allow our country to develop its real capacities and harness its full potential. Whatever happens, the government will find in Cuba a strong determination to defend its sovereign right to build an independent socialist future of its own, free from foreign interference and committed to peace, sustainable development, social justice, and solidarity. The government will also find that we are ready and willing to hold a serious, responsible dialogue and to move towards building a civilized, constructive relationship based on sovereign equality, mutual respect, reciprocal benefits for both parties. And will do so while remaining aware of the profound political differences between our governments. Our people and government deeply appreciate and are very grateful indeed for all the valuable expressions of support and solidarity received. The condemnation of the blockade was one of the most frequently mentioned issues during the recently held high-level segment of the UN General Assembly. Not one country spoke in favor of the criminal policy that has been imposed against Cuba. They exclaimed, "Cuba is not alone." This exclamation is also one heard increasingly within the United States, even among Cubans who live here and their descendants. Cuba is not alone. Mr. President, distinguished permanent representatives, distinguished delegates, since 1992, this Assembly has called unequivocally for an end to the blockade. The reasons behind that demand are today as valid as they ever were, or even more valid. Soon, the electronic screen of this room will be turned on once more, and you, on behalf of your respective nations, will record once more your position regarding the blockade against Cuba. With your votes in favor, you will reaffirm the right of our people and of all peoples to defend their independence, sovereignty, and self-determination without interference and foreign intervention. When you press the green button on your tables, you will be confirming, as you have done on 31 occasions previously, that the blockade against Cuba is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and of international law, and that it should cease. Support for our resolution will send out a firm message. It will issue a respectful clarion call to the current and future President of the United States to make use of their executive power to repair the grave injustice being committed against our people. What that resolution demands from the United States is not in any way that concessions be made to Cuba. It does not ask for an act of generosity, nor does it ask for preferential treatment. It simply calls for the cessation of abuse and injustice. Cuba has the right to live without a blockade. The Cubans are telling President Biden, drop the blockade. Colossal challenges do not frighten us. As Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruiz said, and I quote, "We will continue to endure the consequences of the blockade, a blockade which will one day be defeated by the dignity of the Cuban people, by the solidarity of peoples, and the almost total opposition of the world's governments, as well as the growing rejection of the American people." End quote. Your support for this resolution will also be an act of fairly recognizing the heroic resistance of the noble, proud, and brotherly Cuban people. On their behalf, I respectfully ask you to vote in favor of Draft Resolution L6 entitled "Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Blockade Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba." Thank you.
Je remercie
I thank His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Perea, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba. We shall now the Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A79L6 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. I ask those who are in favor of draft resolution A79L6 to please so signify. Those against, and abstentions.
Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/79/L6 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
le résultat.
The result of the vote is as follows. 187 votes in favor, 2 votes against, and 1 abstention. Draft resolution A79L6 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes, and they should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the representative of Hungary on behalf of the European Union.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as San Marino, aligned themselves with this statement. Once again, I need to stress today our conviction that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States on Cuba has a damaging impact on the economic situation of the country and negatively affect the living standards of the Cuban people. We should keep in mind that external trade and foreign investment, which are undermined by the embargo, can play a crucial role in setting the country on a path towards modernization, reforms, and sustainable growth, and help it overcome the economic hardship endured by the population. The EU considers, therefore, that lifting the embargo could make economic reforms more effective and facilitate the opening of the Cuban economy to the benefit of the Cuban people. We remain concerned about the human rights situation in Cuba, in particular following the events of July 2021, about the severe judgments issued by Cuban courts so far, and about the respect of civil and political rights. We therefore reiterate our call on the Cuban government to fully grant its citizens internationally recognized civil, political, and economic rights and freedoms, including freedom of assembly, freedom of expression and demonstration, and free access to information, to release all political prisoners and those arbitrarily detained, to ratify the UN Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and to extend a standing invitation to all UN special procedures to visit Cuba. We strongly emphasize the importance of upholding the UN Charter and respecting the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all UN members, and urge Cuba to stand in full solidarity with these fundamental principles and work together for their defense. We further believe that empowering civil society is essential for the promotion and protection of all human rights, and call upon the Cuban government to open spaces for a constructive and inclusive dialogue without preconditions with the whole spectrum of civil society actors on the island. A broad spectrum of civil society, both Cuban and European, should also be involved in the implementation of the EU-Cuba political dialogue and cooperation agreement. The EU believes that positive change in Cuba is best brought about by closer engagement at all levels, government, economy, civil society, but also through people-to-people exchanges. We therefore welcome any measures to ease restrictions on family remittances and travel to the island and to ensure the availability of full consular services. The redesignation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism by the previous US administration without presenting any new facts, and its maintenance on the list until today without obvious justification, has introduced additional obstacles to international financial transactions with the island. We call thus for its removal. Moreover, the embargo continues to restrict Cuba's ability to import, among others, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and other medical supplies. Beyond the damaging impact of the embargo and the SST listing on ordinary Cubans, US sanctions and other administrative and judicial measures are also negatively affecting EU economic interests. We have firmly and continuously opposed any such measures due to their extraterritorial application and impact on the European Union in violation of commonly accepted rules of international trade. We cannot accept that such measures impede our economic and commercial relations with Cuba. The EU strongly rejects the US activation of Title 3 and 4 of the Helms-Burton Act in April 2019. This breaches the commitments made by the US in the US-EU agreement of 1997 and 1998. We will draw on all appropriate measures to address the effects of the Helms-Burton Act, including in relation to our WTO rights and through the use of the EU blocking statute, which protects against extraterritorial application of those US sanctions to EU citizens, businesses, and NGOs operating in Cuba. Mr. President, for the EU, international cooperation, dialogue, and closer, even critical engagement are the way to go with Cuba. The provisional application of the EU-Cuba political dialogue and cooperation agreement is now in its 7th year. The agreement has put our bilateral relationship on a new and solid legal footing and sets out an agenda of constructive but critical engagement with Cuba that will also allow us to support and accompany Cuba on its path of reform and modernization. We are enhancing dialogue and cooperation also on issues on which we still have fundamental differences. To this end, the PDCA includes a human rights dialogue, which is a key pillar of our relationship. The 4th formal meeting of the dialogue was held on 24 November 2023 and resulted in the agreement of 4 initial outcomes, including the discussion of potential cooperation projects in various areas of human rights, including food, housing, healthcare, energy, culture, environment, climate change, citizens' participation, attention to persons and groups or groups in vulnerable situations, and the accepted recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review, among others. The next meeting is expected to initiate a new cycle of political dialogues in 2025. Following the adoption of the country's new constitution and to overcome the current economic and social crisis, we call on Cuba to ensure that its reform agenda extends economic, judicial, and social reforms and is implemented in a manner that addresses the key concerns of the Cuban population, as well as meeting the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Cuban people for more opportunities to participate in the shaping of the country's future. With the EU-Cuba political dialogue and cooperation agreement, the EU offers Cuba a consistent and reliable partnership to support it as it seeks to reform its political and economic model to pursue sustainable development and to find common solutions to global challenges while continuing to advocate democracy and respect for human rights in the inclusive interest of all Cuban citizens. It is our considered view that the U.S. embargo and connected measures do not contribute to promoting these aims. On the contrary, they impede their achievement. Against this background, the member states of the European Union voted unanimously in favor of the draft resolution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Hungary, who spoke on behalf of the European Union. I now give the floor to the representative of Timor-Leste.
Thank you, Mr. President. We extend our gratitude to His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parella for his comprehensive presentation on the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America on Cuba. Mr. President, today we stand united with fellow member states in advocating for the rights and development of the Cuban people. This resolution embodies our collective aspiration and enhanced freedom, economic growth, and global cooperation. Timor-Leste's constant support to this resolution is rooted in our commitment to international law, human rights, and equitable development. As a friend of the United States and other Western democracies, we believe that common sense and international order should prevail. The embargo has caused severe humanitarian and economic repercussions, obstructing Cuba's sustainable development and inflicting suffering on its citizens. For instance, half of Cuba was plugged into darkness for several nights due to the failure of the thermoelectric plant in Matanza province of East Havana, as the required maintenance of this infrastructure has been affected by the embargo. As a nation that has faced similar challenges, Timor-Leste resonates with Cuba's struggles. Our support reflects this urgent need for dialogue, cooperation, and collective action to address global challenges between the parties in dispute. Economic sanctions hinder development and disproportionately impact vulnerable populations. The Cuban people have the right to participate in global economy free from restrictive measures. Similar to the United States, who has been a strategic and important partner for Timor-Leste, Cuba has also demonstrated international solidarity, providing invaluable assistance to Timor-Leste, including donors and educational opportunities. On this footing, we call upon the international community and the United States to reevaluate the embargo, remove Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, and engage in a constructive dialogue worth saving and lives of many Cubans who are affected by embargo. A collaborative approach can lead to sustainable outcomes benefiting Cuba, the United States, and the international community. Our support embodies our vision of a just world where sovereignty is respected and rights and well-being are recognized. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Timor-Leste. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members of the General Assembly. The United States stands with the Cuban people. We strongly support their pursuit of a future with respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Approximately 1,000 unjustly detained political prisoners remain behind bars in Cuba, more than at any point in Cuba's recent history. Nearly 700 of those detentions are connected to the July 11th, 2021 historic protests. These people have languished in horrible conditions in Cuban jails for exercising their freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly to demand better living conditions from their government. Despite Cuba's membership in the UN Human Rights Council, the Cuban government has delayed responding to several requests by special procedures that mandate holders of the UN Human Rights Council send independent experts to Cuba who would help advance respect for human rights including freedom of expression, freedom of religion or belief, and the freedom of peaceful assembly. Some of these requests have remained pending for more than 10 years. Sanctions are one element of our broader effort to advance democracy and promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms in Cuba. We therefore oppose this resolution. That said, we recognize the challenges the Cuban people face. That is why U.S. sanctions include exemptions and authorizations relating to exports of food, medicine, and other basic goods to Cuba. The United States remains a significant source of basic goods to the Cuban people. In 2023, the United States exported nearly $336 million in agricultural products and authorized another $100 billion in humanitarian exports, demonstrating America's desire to help the Cuban people. We encourage this body to urge the Cuban government to adhere to its human rights obligations and listen to the Cuban people and their aspirations to determine their own future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of a vote after the vote. The exercise of the right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and to 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, as we see every year, the U.S. once again has used lies and manipulation to justify the blockade against Cuba. As it also does every year, its isolation grows and its loss of credibility on the international stage as a result of this criminal policy. What they're doing seems to have no limits. They hold the Cuban government responsible for the suffocation caused by the blockade imposed on our country. Not even one word we heard from the U.S. referred to Cuba's denomination as a supposed sponsor of terrorism. Many delegations today and yesterday rejected that designation in this very chamber. The only goal of that arbitrary measure is to ratchet up the blockade and to cause more suffering for the Cuban people. The U.S. in vain is seeking to bring to the Assembly false figures regarding the exports to Cuba and humanitarian aid. They're cynically using multi-million-dollar sums from the U.S. Development Agency they're allocating that to subversion in Cuba. They're also stymieing remittances, and they're using scant remittances that do arrive to our country to subvert our order. At the same time, they're stepping up their economic war to ultimately ensure our economic collapses. The government of the U.S. has said that it is a trading partner of Cuba. However, it persecutes our transactions. It intends to visit reprisals upon any nation that sells to ours products that are made with 10% UN components, or any business that exports to the U.S. Products containing Cuban raw materials. In order to sustain the hostility of the blockade, the U.S. is deliberately manipulating the issue of human rights. The United States has no moral authority whatsoever to issue lessons about human rights, neither to Cuba or to any other nation. We are all very well aware of how they make opportunistic use of the issue of human rights to justify their hegemonic actions and their interventionist policies. The government of the United States has not ratified 72% of the primary international human rights treaties, is responsible for extrajudicial executions, abductions, and torture. They retain in legal limbo prisoners on Cuban territory that it illegally occupies via the Guantanamo base. At the same time, they hold up human rights and they claim to be defenders of freedom of speech. They, at the same time, quell peaceful student demonstrations against the complicity of the U.S. government in the genocide against the Palestinian people. The United States is far and away the nation with the highest number of firearm-related homicides and mass shootouts. Only last year in that country there were at least 656 mass shootings and more than 43,000 people died at the hands of armed violence. This means that on average 118 deaths occur a day. No other country even comes close to that chilling figure. The police brutality is part of the daily reality of life in the United States. It's no surprise that in a country in which racial discrimination is systemic, Afro-American people disproportionately suffer from the use of lethal force, and they are more than 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. What human rights can a country seriously talk about where their children can be tried as adults and sentenced to life in prison? More than 10,000 young people are in adult prisons in the US. If the US really is interested in the well-being of the Cuban people and in respecting democracy, it would listen to the majority of the citizens of its own country that call for the lifting of Cuba's blockade. If the US really wants to champion human rights in Cuba, they would immediately lift the blockade. It is a flagrant, mass and systematic violation of human rights of the Cuban people. If the United States respected the international community as well as the UN Charter and international law, it would comply with the 32 resolutions that the GA has adopted calling for the lifting of the blockade against Cuba. I conclude by reiterating on behalf of the government and people of Cuba our deep gratitude to all member states that with their voice and vote have supported the legitimate request of Cuba for the blockade to be lifted once and for all. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba. May I take it that it is the wish of the Assembly to conclude its consideration of Agenda Item 38? It is so decided. The meeting is adjourned.